Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for this segment, we have Bradley Tusk, founder of Tusk Venture Partners and venture capital firm based in New York City. Bradley's a former politician and campaign manager working with Chuck Schumer, Mike Bloomberg, Andrew Yang, and others. He also served as Uber's first political advisor and helped them launch in New York City. And Bradley joins me today to discuss regulation around the metaverse and crypto and what Elon Musk means for Twitter. Bradley, we have a lot to unpack here. Welcome to Trade Talks. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and it's obvious that issues of safety, privacy, taxation, how workers are classified, consumer regulations, this already preoccupies tech today. And it will be critical to functioning of the metaverse, not to mention cross-border standardization. What are the challenges there in terms of technology and policy?
Yeah. So look, the first thing is all the policies that we already should have put in place to regulate Internet 2.0 are going to be that much exacerbated as problems if we don't do it for the metaverse or Web 3. So, in many ways, I like to think about the metaverse as the current internet times 10. Everything good times 10, everything bad times 10, right? And we have these fundamental problems right now in the US where there's no framework for privacy. So all of us, there's no protection of our data. There's no interoperability of our data. And so that has to happen. Number two is this thing called Section 230, which is basically eliminates liability for the platforms, for the content posted by the users. The reason why this is really important is it creates perverse incentives for Facebook and Twitter and others. The more toxic a site, the more controversial, the more clicks they generate, the more ads they sell, the more money they make. The only way to change that is to say, no, you're going to be liable for what's on there. So if it is slanderous or libelous, you're going to have to pay for it. That will finally force them to do some real content moderation. And the third is antitrust, right? We just have all of these giant tech companies, some specifically on internet, some beyond that, but that are just major monopolies at this point, whether it's Amazon or Facebook or Apple, and they should all be split up. And these are the three, to me, first issues that have to be dealt with.
Yeah, and Bradley, part of the challenge with that is these are US-based companies, right? It's largely US-centric. If we think about policy standardization globally anyway, even just using the EU and the US as examples, the way that we approach privacy and our fundamentals around freedom of speech are very, very different.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, Europe, I think, in this case, has gotten a lot of this right. So there's something called GDPR, which is their overall privacy framework. And then last week, or maybe it was early this week, they formally enacted something called the Digital Services Act, which is the equivalent of repealing Section 230 and putting more and more responsibility and liability on the platforms to protect people. So Europe has, and I think maybe speech isn't quite as inherent of a right in Europe or seen that way as it's here. Like, look, the First Amendment is in many ways what this country is about, right? It's the whole formation of who we are, but it's not an absolute. So just like you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater, you don't have the right to say or do whatever you want, regardless of the truth, at any cost on any platform. And until we start putting some just basic sensible regulations in there, we're going to have an internet run amok, and it just is all totally toxic.
So what are potential first steps?
Yeah, so the first steps, I think, would be, one, Congress actually dealing with these three issues that I just said. But the second is, we know, like you said, there's going to be regulatory challenges for the metaverse around consumer protection, around taxation, around national security, worker classification, all of these things. At the very least, why don't we put together like the 20 smartest people in each of these fields and say, okay, what do we do? How should we regulate this thing? Like, rather than what normally happens in tech, which is, government's totally unaware of it, platform launches of some kind, the entrenched interest is being disrupted, complains to the government, and then they first start trying to deal with it, which, by the way, in my day job as venture capitalist is sort of usually I'm the one fighting off the regulation. But I think in this case, we know the metaverse is coming. We know all these problems are going to happen. So rather than sort of waiting until it's a crisis again, how about we can actually get ahead of it?
So how will the metaverse be governed? Who legally has the power to run it? And again, you don't want to run into that risk that we see with Web 2, where there's a handful of huge conglomerates that are running it at the end of the day.
Yeah, and look, just to make you a little more nervous, by far and away, the biggest investors in metaverse R&D are Apple, Microsoft, and Facebook. So they are fully planning on doing it. And if it's up to them, they'll create what we call walled gardens, which means once you're in their metaverse, it make it really hard for you to go to use your data on anyone else's metaverse. And that's really unfair. So if you're creating an avatar that's a reflection of who you are digitally, you have to go where you have the freedom to go where you want to go. It can't be like, oh, I have to create an entirely new person now for Microsoft and another one for Apple, another one for Facebook. They want that because it keeps you in their metaverse where you spend more money. So we've got to basically require them to allow people to have the freedom to go where they want within the metaverse. So I think in terms of regulation, it's a little bit like it is now in the sense that there are things that have to get done on a federal level, like privacy, like antitrust, but there's a lot on the local level too. So for example, taxation. If I were a state or city government, I would be terrified of the metaverse, because if people are all of a sudden start doing a lot of their purchasing digitally online in the metaverse, if you throw up a VPN, they're not going to know where you're buying it from. And then all of a sudden, collectively tens of billions of dollars of tax revenue disappears, right? Or say if I'm the state government and I run a lottery. Lottery is currently a $95 billion industry in the US, funds a lot of schools and everything else. If you can now in the metaverse, at any time you want, be in the coolest casino in Monte Carlo with the most glamorous people around you, throwing dice, who's going to walk down to the bodega and buy a pick six or a scratch off, right? Nobody. So I do think government has both some real threats, and that's true at all levels of government, especially local and municipal, but also opportunities. So imagine a world where the only time in your life you ever went to the DMV was for your driving test, and for the rest of your life, you just do it in the metaverse. Everything you need gets covered there. Any kind of government benefits, services. So, there's a lot that governments, especially state and local, can do to improve constituent services through the metaverse, but they also have a lot of risk.
Yeah, well, let's talk about something else when we talk about democratizing access and then being able to educate the workforce for these kinds of Web3 jobs and so forth. How do you avoid another digital divide? I mean, we saw that really clear when COVID had happened, and we saw what happened when you have a business that is not digitized.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that given that we know this is all coming, this has to be something that becomes a curriculum in schools, has to be offered as programs to, like, every city, and I worked at City Hall in New York for a long time, every city has all kinds of small business services tools that they offer, right? But a lot of the times the tools were invented 30, 40 years ago, and they don't apply to today's economy and today's society. They should be updated to say, okay, you're not going to be able to exist at all if you're not in the metaverse. Here's what you need to do, and at least put together some basic functionality for people so that your brick and mortar stores don't continue to disappear. I live in Manhattan, and 1 out of every 3 storefronts, it feels like, is vacant right now. And that's just going to get worse and worse. And that makes the city a worse place to live and makes it more dangerous. So for city government, especially, to protect your own underlying infrastructure and your own underlying economy, you should be providing these things proactively and for free to your local businesses.
Yeah, great point. I mean, just calling workers back to work isn't going to resolve, longer term solutions. Let's talk about something more event driven that we can relate to as it stands today. Elon Musk acquiring Twitter. I mean, could he become the be all and end all of what happens on the global town square, as he calls it?
Yeah, for sure. So look, I have a couple of different thoughts that were maybe a little bit disjointed, but let me throw them at you. So the first is my view of the reason why he just paid $44 billion to do this is Tesla is the company that has the least correlation between revenue and profits and actual share price, right? If there was actually a correlation, Tesla would be worth like 1/10 the market value. Elon, because he's the biggest shareholder in Tesla, has become the world's richest person because through the hype machine of Twitter and Reddit and things like that, the retail investors have driven the price way up. He'll take SpaceX public sometime in the near future. Same thing. So I think from his mind, Twitter is just a tool to keep the valuations of his other companies really, really high. And those are worth much more money to him than whatever Twitter costs or doesn't cost. So that's number one. Number two, he has an opportunity, I think, to do a real public service here and make Twitter a less harmful, less toxic place. But so far, everything he's saying is the opposite. When he's saying free speech, I think what it means is even less moderation, even less control, which means more hate speech, more animosity, more polarization. And that doesn't just mean that societies ripped apart within the platform of Twitter, it rips us apart across the board. It's not surprising that the US Congress can't even talk to each other anymore between the two parties because they effectively live on Twitter in many ways, and then it plays itself out in real life every single day. And so I think that if he does the plans he's talking about, the dysfunction and polarization of this country will grow that much worse. And then finally, we'll talk about this a bit before we went on the air, Section 230, which we mentioned before, which protects the companies from liability by user content. I think at least until Musk's purchase of Twitter, it was politically achievable because it's one of those issues where there happens to be bipartisan agreement. The Republicans hate Facebook, the Democrats hate Facebook. They hate them for different reasons, but they all know that they hate them. And it'd be a big fight. But now that the world's richest person with 83 million Twitter followers is on the other side of it, it's going to make the fight that much harder. So our ability to regulate the internet properly now gets worse. Our ability to make the internet better in the future gets worse. And I think fundamentally, this is just a vehicle for him to continue hyping up the value of the shares, stocks.
All right, Bradley, appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade
Thank you
Talks.
for having me.
You got it. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.